the content and format and linked to content and format, the signatory parties of the IP, you'll see we can have 1, 2, 3 documents separated that are together called an Integrity Pact. How this format and content it's related to the legal framework and limitations in different countries. What are the main components in the IP content? And there are four main elements that we are including in a blueprint for an IP: a good governance and integrity pledge by the contracting authority, a pledge on transparency and integrity by the supplier or the private sector participating in public investment and procurement, the civil society monitoring framework and agreement, and the dispute resolution and sanctioning initiatives. The 4 elements can be broken down in 3, 2, or can be brought together complementary in one single document. And the format, it's not influencing the content, or it's influencing the content, but not the essence of the Integrity Pact. On, let's say, content and a bit on the format, I said we have 4 main components. The good governance and the integrity pledge, it's the pledge of the contracting authorities. It may be also part of the pledge of the managing authorities together with the contracting authorities, but by definition, it should be the pledge of the contracting authority to follow the regulations related to anti-corruption and integrity, to transparency, to whistleblower protection. And there are additional pledges and commitments that the contracting authorities can do, and the civil society, the monitor, it's promoting in the framework of the Integrity Pact, and I will present that. This pledge should be signed, or ideally it's signed as early as possible in the IP process. And because it's signed as early as possible, it's in many situations different from the second component, that it's the supplier and transparency and integrity pledge, that it's the part of the bidders, the contractors, so the private sector. The private sector, it's included, but has a lower role, a smaller role in preparing the tendering documents, the procurement. Before that, the needs assessment and the feasibility studies for the investments that are done through procurement. So in most of the cases, they cannot sign this pledge from the beginning of a preparatory stage for a public procurement and investment, but they should sign this. And because of that, in some cases, this is a separate document. The civil society monitoring agreement, it's the third component, but it's a component that it's linking together actually the good governance pledge and the supplier transparency and integrity pledge. It's the agreement that it's saying, well, these pledges are not just simple words, are not simple papers signed by different parties. They are monitored by a civil society monitor. And this, again, should be signed as early as possible. In our experience, it may be signed, it should include the contracting authority, but it may be signed from the beginning by the managing authority or the funding body for the Integrity Pact with the civil society organization, that it's the civil society monitor. And together with the contracting authority, this monitoring agreement, it's part of the Integrity Pact. It may be exactly the same document as the God Governance and Integrity Pledge. They may be in the same document or in separate documents. A dispute resolution with dispute resolution clauses with elements related to sanctions and incentives should be included in any format of the Integrity Pact. They are usually included in the form of dispute resolution and sanctions in the monitoring agreement, but they can also be included with elements related to dispute resolution, sanctions, and incentives in the document the bidders and contractors are signing in order to incentivize them, and also to provide not only some carrots, but also to show some sticks when related to sanctions, if possible. They are also can be part of the good governance and integrity pledge. As I said, they may be different documents. The experience we have in Romania and in other projects that have been piloted in the European Union in the last decade almost, it's that we had first a separate monitoring agreement, then an integrity pact signed by the contracting authorities with the civil society monitor, and a separate pledge or agreement signed by the bidders, if is a pledge, or separately by or together as an agreement by the contracting authorities, the contractors, and the civil society monitor as a full integrity pact. But we went in many times in stages, because as I will say also later, bidders, contractors, the business sector, it's coming to the process, and it's important to be included in the process. But exactly who can sign and who should sign the pledges, it's decided by the procurement process actually later in project preparation and procurement preparation. And also, sorry, the second option is to have a three-party agreement and suppliers to sign actually a document that it's signed at the beginning by the contracting authority and the civil society monitor, and left unsigned for the bidders, signed by the bidders and then the supplier, the contractors, when they are participating in the process or selected. So the second option, it's not to have this puzzle of different documents, pledges with one or two signatories, but a document that it's a three-party agreement, that it's signed at the beginning by the two parties that we know, and left to be completed and signed by the business sector. This is theoretically how the format of the Integrity Pact started, but it's less used at this moment, at least in the European Union. Also, there is, and I'm going now at the elements related to how the Integrity Pact is interacting with the legal framework in different countries. And one of the things that it's most varying between European countries is according to the national laws that are actually transposing the European directive on procurement. In some countries, including the Integrity Pact as a mandatory element for bidders, it's possible. In other countries, as the law is formulated in the interpretation of most of the contracting authorities and in some cases of the procurement authorities, it's not possible to add to the criteria and things to ask as mandatory for the bidders. So the Integrity Pact is not mandatory for the bidders, and this generates another thing to do, actually, to convince at least the successful bidder, the contractor, to sign the suppliers transparency and integrity pledge. What is important, again, it's that the IP, irrespective of the form and the provision of the procurement legislation and the legislation in other areas, can be adapted to the legal framework in each country in order to have the benefit of the civil monitoring, the pledges, and additional supervision for the large procurements that the Integrity Pact it's providing. The legal framework, it's influencing the IP commitments and activities, the four elements, and especially the pledge for good governance, for good governance and for the suppliers can be influenced. The first thing is that everything that is mandatory by the law, it's included in the pledges. So when what is mandatory by the law, it's varying. Some things are covered by the pledge by definition and by default. Some others can be negotiated. Also, elements related to sanctions, when covered by the law already, can be applied pretty easily. If not, they need to be negotiated. The second point that it's influencing a lot what it's included in the Integrity Pact as a legal document, either an agreement or a pledge. As we saw it from experience, it's the access to information for the monitor, and it's not access to public information. It's actually the access the civil society monitor has to confidential information. In some countries, by signing the monitoring agreement that it's part of the Integrity Pact, the civil society monitor can have access to any information of the process. In other countries, some of the things are, according to the law, more confidential than others. And I think here, Romania, it's a very good example. For the Romanian case, the law says the tendering documents, until being published with the tender announcement, are confidential, but they can be shared with the civil society monitor if the civil society monitor signs confidentiality declaration. And this is happening. This have been the practice for Integrity Pacts in Romania. On the other hand, the law, the same legal provisions are saying very clearly that for the evaluation committee for the tenders, only the members of the evaluation committee have access to documents and proceedings. And the law, it's formulated in a way that most of the authorities interpreting the law, including the procurement authority in Romania, says in this case the confidentiality is extremely strict, and the monitor cannot actually participate in that stage, that it's the evaluation of the bids from the bidders, of the proposal from the bidders. And this is a limitation that we have in Romania. We cannot actually participate in real time to that proceedings. We get all the documents. We can have meetings after the evaluation of the proposals, but we cannot, as a civil society monitor, participate in that meetings. colleagues from other countries in Europe have access to that meetings, the evaluation committee meetings, and all the proceedings and documents, because the law is not formulated in that way that makes the confidentiality of the evaluation of the proposals so strict as in Romania. So this is, I think, a good example, and the IP can be adapted. What we did in Romania, it's actually asking documents from the evaluation of the proposals as soon as possible after the committee finalized its work. We got them before the procurement contracts have been signed. So if we identified any irregularities, it was not the case, but if we would identify any irregularities, we could stop signing the contract if needed. It was not the case, fortunately. The third thing that may vary in legislation, there are many things that vary, but the four that I present are the most important, and the things that we encountered more in Europe. It's mandatory or voluntary signature by the suppliers. In some legal frameworks, it is not possible to add this obligation for the suppliers to sign, the suppliers or the bidders. In some cases, it was possible not to ask the bidders, but to ask to make mandatory for the selected bidder, for the contractor. In other countries, as Romania, it was not possible at all. How we negotiate this, it's both on soft measures and hard measures. The soft measures have a plan to convince bidders to sign. This is part of what the monitor is doing. Part of it, it's communication and advocacy. I would say in Romania, because we designed our activities in a way that will support suppliers and not generate administrative burdens for them. We didn't have a challenge to convince them to sign, although it was not mandatory. The other thing, not the soft measures, the hard measures, it's to include actually access for the civil society monitor to all the documents and works of the suppliers through the contracting authorities in the contracting, the procurement contract. So although the suppliers are not signing, because the contracting authority, it's asking them to provide documents to the civil society monitor, then legally, although they don't necessarily want and they cannot be made to sign the Integrity Pact, suppliers will be part of the Integrity Pact. And we generally promote the soft approach rather than the hard one, but we also have, as I said, legal measures to make suppliers to participate in the Integrity Pact, although they may be opposed to signing. What I need to say, it's also that if signature is voluntary and suppliers refuse to sign a transparency and integrity pledge, this is the first red flag that something is not going right with the supplier, and they would like actually not to be transparent. And this theoretically is also should raise some questions to the contracting authority, or should raise some red flags for more intense and more attentive monitoring from the contracting authority, not only from the civil society monitor. The fourth element that may vary according to the law is the reporting and the way of addressing irregularities. In some cases, irregularities and addressing them can be part of the Integrity Pact. In other cases, with specific sanctions included in the document. In other cases, the law, it's pretty clear on what sanctions can be applied, and then other sanctions cannot be added by the Integrity Pact. I'll stop here because I spoke about different elements in laws in different countries.